just make sure you think your way through it a little bit.
Hi, I'm Jackie Reid and welcome to Lethal's Last Word for round 12. We've got a couple of interesting games to focus on involving some teams who need the win to justify their finals credibility. One of those teams is Carlton. And Lee, as I welcome you, the Blues are up against Hawthorn and they really need a big scalp this week.
Well, they need the big scalp, but more than that, they need the 4 points because they're sort of stuck in that middle of the list group. And I think Hawthorn have been playing the lesser sides just lately, so it's a great matchup going in.
Well, let's take a look at the last 4 games for both sides. And while the Hawks have got a perfect record, Carlton stumbled last week against Essendon.
Yeah, well, Essendon are one of the really good teams. That was a pretty good performance by Carlton last week. Certainly Waite was a dominant influence up forward. Hawthorn, of course, had the bye, and then they've been playing pretty much bottom third teams. But it's that 6-5. That is the key thing for Carlton. They need to get to be 7-5. 6-6 after 12 rounds. You've got to do a lot of good work to make finals from that point onwards.
Well, both of these sides have a similar weapon, which is your key indicator for this clash, that run-off half-back. They get it from 2 important players, Grant Birchall and Andrew Walker.
Well, they're both similar types of players. They're good balancing defenders in that they can play a little bit taller if need be, but basically they're the runners off half-back.
Well, Walker's metres gain is number 3 in the comp and he's second in effective long kicks as well.
Absolutely. They're ball carriers, aren't they? When they run the ball off half-back, when you look what's their difference, I think Walker's better in the air. If it's a high ball, I think Walker's got that loop, so he's better in the aerial contest. I think Birchall is probably better with ball in hand. I think he's more precise. He finds the target better, both by hand and foot. And every now and again, they might get towards the 50-metre line. So they're 2 really damaging players.
Well, both of these sides in the past have used defensive half-forwards to combat that type of damaging defender. Do you think they'll do that this week?
Well, they might. I think I wouldn't be surprised if maybe even a Lewis goes back and plays. He often will play that defensive forward on a weight-type player. Sometimes they use Paropolo, but I think he's too tall. So I suspect maybe Lewis might get the job because Walker is critical, I think, for Carlton's defensive rebound.
Well, let's take a look at your key player for the game, Jared Roughead. He's beginning to hit the heights he reached in the Hawks flag season of 2008, isn't he?
We remember back when Hawthorn won the premiership in 2008. Roughead and Franklin between them kicked 188 goals. I think Franklin was about 113. Roughead was 75. And Roughead, he's had injuries. He just hasn't been quite the same player. But this year, he's really just all of a sudden he's a comeback player. Every now and again, they'll even use him in the middle as a ground level player. But I just think Franklin, we know how good he is, but I think it is so much, you're so much stronger if you've got that second big forward who is a really dangerous target. So all of a sudden, Roughead is actually really back to his best.
Will the Hawks stretch the Blues' defence by loading up with Roughead, Franklin and Hale all in attack?
Well, I think they will because Simon White's been left out of the Carlton team, so that's one big defender not there. And you might have Hale in the forward line, you might have Roughead, you might have Franklin all at the same time. So it's really going to stretch the Carlton tools back there.
Well, let's take a look at your key tactic for this match, and it might be the way that they use Lachie Henderson.
Well, it's to do with that basic issue. I think Carlton, last week when Jared Waite kicked 6 goals in the first quarter against Essendon, they were fantastic. But he was sold. He was just absolutely one out. I've seen Henderson here play some good footy in the forward line. But I think Carlton are really locked into having to play defence, particularly, as we said, they've left Simon White out. So that means Jamieson and Henderson have to be the 2 main big defenders. So, I'm sure Mick Malthouse would love to play him as maybe that second or third forward around Jared Waite, but I think he's going to have to play defence this week.
OK, Lee, last word. Who's going to win?
I think Hawthorn will win. I mean, Sirioli's still missing out of the team through injury, but I think they're a better team, and Carlton will give them a good run for it, but I think Hawthorn.
Well, that's Lethal's last word on the big Friday night clash between the Blues and the Hawks. On Saturday afternoon at the MCG, it's the classic 8-point game as 9th plays 10th, Richmond versus Adelaide, in what's almost an early elimination final, Lee.
Well, it is, but I think it's more so for the Crows. I mean, Crows are 5-6 going into this game, so they lose this game, you're 5-7. That's a long way back.
Well, let's take a look at their last 4 weeks. The Crows have suffered what was probably their worst loss in the last 2 years, while the Tigers had arguably their best win for the last few seasons.
Well, as we know, Richmond have got a game in hand. They've only played 10 games. The Crows have already played 11. But certainly the Crows have been able to beat the middle of this teams, but have been unable to get over the top of the good teams, Fremantle and Sydney. And, of course, last week, Richmond's win over the Eagles in Perth, well, that was their best win of the year.
your key players for this game, and you've got a couple of unheralded midfielders, Richard Douglas for the Crows and Nathan Foley for the Tigers.
Well, I often think of these as the worker bees in the respective midfielders. They're not necessarily the stars. I mean, Douglas is just an unheralded player, but we see the way he's followed up, he's ran hard. I always think Richmond are better when Foley's in the team fit and well. I think he gives their midfield some speed and some acceleration away from the contest. But as I say, they're just the two real worker bees. They're both the tackling midfielders. They're both the highest tacklers in both their teams.
Well, Douglas is the #1 in the competition for goal assists at the moment as well.
Yeah, no, he's been very good, very creative. So, again, there'll be Dangerfield and Thompson, a lot of players, I think, that are more highly fancied. But I think Douglas and Foley are going to be really critical.
Well, let's look at a couple of key matchups, beginning with Patrick Dangerfield and his likely shadow for the afternoon, Daniel Jackson.
Well, whenever you go to the Crows, Dangerfield is their most dangerous player. I mean, we see this game against the Lions a few weeks ago, ran out of the centre bounce, kicked the long left foot goal. But if he can really carry the ball, so he's a really damaging, penetrating midfielder, so a really good player.
Do you think he'll spend an equal amount of time up forward as well as in the midfield?
Well, they'd like two of him, wouldn't it? Because he's a capable midfield, I mean, a really good midfielder, but also a capable forward 50 player. Now, maybe Daniel Jackson is the type of player that'll get the matchup. He often, the slightly taller midfielder, I mean, certainly in a running race, I'm sure Dangerfield will be too quick, but he does hang in there and sticks pretty close, Jackson. So he's the one who'll nullify Dangerfield, I would think.
And the other key matchup we're going to take a look at is the ruck battle of Ivan Maric versus Sam Jacobs.
Well, interesting. Remember, Maric was ex-Crows. He went to Richmond last year, had a fantastic first year in 2012. So Jacobs virtually pushed him out of the Crows. So it'll be a really good emotional battle between those two. They were both magnificent in 2012, almost all Australian selections, but neither of them I don't think have been as good this particular year. But the hit-outs don't always lead to the clearances, but it's a critical part of the game. So therefore, who can dominate in the rucks is always a fair starting point.
Well, who needs to prove themselves more in this game?
Well, Jacobs compared to 2012 has had a fair bit of a downer in 2013, so they'll both be pretty keen, I think, to make sure they overcome their direct opponents.
OK, last word. Who do you think is going to win?
I'm sticking to Richmond. I still don't trust them totally. If they played like they did against the Eagles the last round before the bye, I think they'll win comfortably. But they don't always do that, but I'm still sticking to the Tigers.
Well, let's take a look at your tips for round 12, starting with the Blues versus the Hawks.
Well, looking at the out of 10, I reckon Hawks are going to beat the Blues 8 out of 10. So going for them. Richmond, I reckon a 6 out of 10, even in Melbourne, so I'll go for Richmond. I reckon the Dockers in Perth at the moment are probably going to beat the Lions 8 out of 10. Even though the Suns are playing all right, I still think Essendon are going to beat them 9 out of 10 in Melbourne at this point of time. Now, the Giants and the Power, I just don't know about this one. Maybe a 5 out of 5, but I think the Power are capable of playing better, so I'll stick with them. Well, Collingwood against the Bulldogs. The Bulldogs have had a couple of good games, but I reckon Collingwood are going to beat them about 9 out of 10. So the Magpies for me.
Well, thanks for that, Lee.
Thanks, Jackie.
Well, that's another edition of Lethal's Last Word. Thank you for joining us. Enjoy the football across the weekend, and we'll see you next time.